It was a chilly night in Jacksonville, Florida, December 1993. Outside a liquor lounge, the usual hum of nightlife was shattered by the roar of an AK-47. Within seconds, bullets tore through a parked car. 2 people were left dead. It seemed random, senseless, but what unfolded next was anything but straightforward. And now, over 30 years later, the man convicted of that violent ambush, Michael Bernard Bell, is just days away from execution. But he says he's not the monster the state made him out to be. And some people believe him. This is the story of a man haunted by loss, of families torn apart, and of a justice system some say was too eager for a conviction. With new claims of misconduct and last-minute appeals, Bell's case has become one of the most contested and emotional death row stories in Florida's recent history. So, what really happened that night in Jacksonville? And why are some people calling this execution a grave mistake? Let's take it from the beginning. Before we dive into the chaos of that December night, it's important to step back and meet the people whose lives would forever change. Michael Bernard Bell wasn't born into privilege. Like many young men growing up in parts of Jacksonville during the late 60s and 70s, his life was marked by struggle, economic hardship, racial inequality, and limited opportunities. By the time he hit his teenage years, Bell was already navigating a tough world with too few safety nets. But he wasn't always in trouble. Those who knew him remember flashes of potential. A sharp mind, a protective older brother, someone who could make you laugh or lend a hand when no one else would. And then came the tragedy that would shape him forever. His younger brother was murdered. That loss would fester inside Bell like an open wound. Friends would later say he was never the same. That grief turned into suspicion, and then into obsession. Bell became convinced he knew who was behind his brother's murder, and that the justice system wasn't going to do a thing about it. Then there's Jimmy West, one of the victims in the December 1993 shooting. Jimmy was known in the neighborhood, a guy with a reputation, but also a family. He had a girlfriend, Tamecka Smith, who happened to be in the car with him that night. Tamecka wasn't the target. She was just there, in the wrong place, at the worst time. These weren't just names on a police report. They were people, with full, complicated lives. And in a single violent moment, all of it unraveled. It was late on December 9th, 1993. A gray Cadillac was parked outside Dolly's Lounge in Jacksonville. Inside the car were Jimmy West and Tamecka Smith. At exactly 11:05 p.m., according to police reports, a man armed with a semi-automatic AK-47 rifle opened fire on the vehicle. Witnesses later described it as a massacre. Dozens of rounds fired in a matter of seconds. The windshield shattered, the car riddled with bullets. West died at the scene. Smith, only 22 years old, succumbed to her injuries shortly after. There was no warning, no confrontation, just an ambush. For police, the motive wasn't immediately clear. But it didn't take long before the name Michael Bell started circulating. Rumors swirled that he believed Jimmy West had something to do with his brother's death, a revenge killing. Even though there was no direct evidence linking West to that murder, Bell reportedly believed it with conviction. When detectives began questioning potential witnesses, a narrative began to form. Bell had been looking for West, and he wasn't planning to talk. But there was a problem. Most of that early information came from people on the street, people scared of retaliation. Some later said they were pressured into pointing the finger. Others claimed they never actually saw Bell at the scene. Still, within days, police made their move. They had their suspect. Michael Bell was arrested less than a week after the shooting. The arrest wasn't quiet. It was a full-scale operation. Police swarmed his location and brought him in with rifles drawn. The community took notice. The media followed. At the station, Bell denied everything. He said he wasn't near Dolly's lounge that night, that he had nothing to do with the killings. But investigators believed otherwise. Enter Detective William Bolena, a veteran cop in Jacksonville known for getting confessions. Some say his methods were effective. Others say coercive. According to recent claims, Bolena and prosecutor George Batte used threats and promises to manipulate witnesses. The defense would later argue that testimonies were coached, and witnesses were offered deals in exchange for pointing the finger at Bell. Still, prosecutors moved forward with confidence. They had a handful of witnesses claiming Bell had talked about getting revenge. Some said he'd shown them the gun. Others said he boasted about the shooting afterward. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no surveillance footage, just words, just testimony. And in 1995, that was enough to take the case to trial. Michael Bell's trial began in Duval County Court in 1995. The prosecution painted a chilling picture. A man consumed by revenge, armed to the teeth and willing to kill. They said Bell wasn't just a murderer, he was a calculated assassin. The state's star witnesses were people from Bell's own orbit. Friends, acquaintances, even a jailhouse informant. Each one told a similar story, that Bell had expressed a desire for vengeance, that he'd talked about taking care of Jimmy West. The defense? They argued the state's case was built on hearsay and fear, that the witnesses had been manipulated, that none of the physical evidence linked Bell to the crime scene. But the jury didn't see it that way. After deliberating, they returned a guilty verdict. And not just for one murder, for two. Jimmy West and Tamecka Smith. At sentencing, the judge handed down the ultimate punishment: death. Michael Bernard Bell was sent to Florida's death row, where he would remain for nearly 3 decades. And that's where things should have ended. But they didn't. Absolutely. Let's pick up right where we left off. For many, a death sentence marks the end of the story. But for Michael Bell, it was only the beginning of another chapter. One steeped in legal battles, isolation, and a lingering sense of injustice. Bell was sent to Florida State Prison in Starke, home to the state's death row. There, prisoners live in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, with limited human contact and even fewer privileges. It's not just punishment, it's waiting. Waiting for news from the courts, waiting for updates from lawyers, waiting to die. In those early years, Bell filed numerous appeals. Most were denied outright. Florida's courts upheld the conviction and the death sentence repeatedly. His legal team would later say it felt like shouting into a void. "We kept raising the same red flags," one former defense attorney said. But no one wanted to listen. Still, Bell kept going. He read legal books, wrote letters, reached out to advocacy groups, to anyone who would listen. He maintained that he didn't pull the trigger that night. And even if he had, he said, the trial was rigged. Over the years, troubling allegations started to surface. Claims that the case had been tainted from the start. But without hard evidence or recantations, those allegations stayed buried in court files and obscure motions. Until recently. In 2024, Bell's defense uncovered something they believed was explosive. According to their motion, the main witnesses at trial had not only been coached, but had also received favorable treatment in exchange for their testimony, details that were never disclosed to the jury. Worse, they claimed that Detective William Bolena and prosecutor George Bate used coercive tactics, including threats of jail time or dropped charges, to secure testimony. One witness who had testified at Bell's original trial, now in his late 40s, told investigators off the record that he had lied under pressure. But when called into court, he refused to testify, invoking his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. And that was the issue. Even as the defense tried to bring these new details to light, the people who held the truth weren't willing, or weren't able, to speak. In June 2025, the courts finally agreed to hold an evidentiary hearing. It was a rare move, one that gave Bell and his attorneys a glimmer of hope. If the judge found merit in the misconduct claims, the execution could be delayed, or even overturned. But once again, key witnesses clammed up. Many invoked the Fifth, and without their cooperation, the judge ruled that there wasn't enough evidence to justify stopping the execution. Bell's team appealed. They asked the Florida Supreme Court for a stay, and the clock kept ticking. On June 13, 2025, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Bell's death warrant. It was the 8th such warrant DeSantis had signed that year, tying a modern state record for executions. Florida hadn't moved this aggressively on death row cases in years, and to many, the timing felt deliberate. The execution was scheduled for July 15th at 6 p.m. at Florida State Prison. Within hours of the warrant being signed, Bell's legal team ramped up their efforts. They filed new motions in state and federal court, arguing that executing Bell would violate his constitutional rights, especially given the unresolved questions about the trial's fairness. Meanwhile, supporters of Bell began to mobilize. Human rights advocates, death penalty opponents, and even some legal professionals called the case deeply flawed. Groups like the Florida Campaign to End the Death Penalty and FADP, Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, urged DeSantis to rescind the warrant, or at the very least, grant a reprieve. But the governor didn't budge. On July 10th, Justice Clarence Thomas received an emergency application, case number 25A45, asking for a stay of execution. The petition laid out the misconduct allegations and argued that the evidentiary hearing had been compromised by witnesses refusing to testify. Without their cooperation, Bell's attorneys said, the truth could never fully come out. The court reviewed the filings. Bell's team hoped for an emergency intervention. Even a temporary stay could buy them time to secure witness cooperation or dig up corroborating evidence. But on July 11th, the Florida Supreme Court issued its ruling. No stay. They found that Bell's claims were not enough to halt the execution, stating that the new evidence wouldn't have likely changed the trial outcome. As Bell's execution date nears, the public conversation has grown louder. For some, this is an open and shut case. 2 people were gunned down. A jury heard the evidence and delivered its verdict. Justice, they say, must be served, even if it's 30 years later. But for others, Bell's story is part of a bigger, more troubling pattern. A black man accused by word-of-mouth testimony. A trial built on shaky witnesses. Claims of prosecutorial misconduct that courts refuse to fully investigate. And a governor pushing for more executions in a political year. Social media campaigns with hashtags like "Stop the Execution," "Justice for Bell" have gained traction. Civil rights groups have issued statements condemning the execution. Even some retired judges have said they're uncomfortable with how fast the process has moved, especially in light of the new misconduct allegations. Journalists, activists, and even some former prosecutors are asking, what if they got it wrong? And what does it say about the system if there's no way to pause and re-examine? One local pastor put it bluntly, "We're not just talking about Michael Bell. We're talking about what kind of justice system we want to live under." To understand why Bell's execution is so controversial, you have to understand Florida's history with capital punishment. Florida has one of the largest death rows in the country, over 300 inmates. And in recent years, under Governor DeSantis, the state has increased its pace of executions dramatically. Critics argue that Florida's death penalty system is broken. They've pointed to multiple exonerations of death row inmates, some freed after decades due to wrongful convictions. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, Florida has had more death row exonerations than any other state. That fact alone raises questions. How many were nearly executed before being proven innocent? How many might still be? There's also the issue of racial bias. Studies show that in Florida, defendants convicted of killing white victims are far more likely to receive the death penalty than those who killed black victims. Michael Bell, a black man convicted of killing another black man and a black woman, is a statistical outlier. But his case still brings up long-standing concerns about fairness and proportionality. In Bell's case, the absence of physical evidence, the allegations of coerced testimony, and the speed of the final rulings have only added fuel to the fire. And with days left, the fire is burning hot. As the sun sets on another day, Michael Bernard Bell sits in a small cell just steps from Florida's execution chamber. He's counting down the hours, watching the clock tick, waiting for a call that may never come. To some, he's a remorseless killer who got what he deserved. To others, he's a victim of a broken system, condemned not by evidence, but by politics and pressure. What's certain is this: 2 people died in December 1993. Families were shattered. Pain never left them. But will another death bring peace? Or just add to the tragedy? Bell may be executed in 3 days, or he may get a last-minute stay. Either way, his story will leave a mark on Jacksonville, on Florida, and on the long, complicated history of justice in America. At 6:25 p.m. on July 15th, 2025, Bell was pronounced dead by lethal injection inside Florida State Prison in Starke. He was 54 years old and had spent nearly 3 decades on death row. His last meal was modest: an omelet with bacon, home fries, and orange juice. As the warden asked for final words, Bell responded softly, "Thank you for not letting me spend the rest of my life in prison." Present in the viewing room were 5 witnesses, 2 from the media, a spiritual advisor, and representatives of both victims, Jimmy West and Tamecka Smith. No immediate family members of Bell were confirmed to have attended. The procedure began shortly after 6 p.m. Bell remained calm throughout. At 6:25 p.m., the state declared him deceased. This marks Florida's 8th execution of 2025 and the 26th nationwide this year, already surpassing the total executions in 2024. His legal team's final appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court was denied, despite claims of witness coercion, missing evidence, and procedural failures dating back to his 1995 trial. For some, today closed a chapter. For others, it opened new questions about fairness, finality, and the irreversible power of the death penalty. Michael B. Bell is now gone, but the conversation about justice in Florida is far from over. This has been True Crime Briefing. If you found this story compelling, subscribe for more deep dives into justice, truth, and everything in between.